What's up, guys? Pat for This Land Boughton here, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about some backyard wilderness plant medicine. And today I want to look at a particular plant called Calendula officinalis, also otherwise known as the pot marigold. However, don't be fooled, this is not a marigold, they're different plant species. Let's talk about some identification in order to figure out how to tell the difference. One of the first dead giveaways is you can see this plant from the ground is about 1.5 feet tall. Your standard marigolds that have the more dome-shaped, multicolored orange and yellow blooms only get about 6 inches tall off the ground. Your calendula will have an either yellow or orange bloom on it like this, and it will get tall. After it has gotten tall, the next thing we want to actually look at, and I'll get a little closer here, is you can see this particular bloom is flat versus domed, and it actually almost looks like a sunflower on the inside there. And that's one of those signs that we're dealing with a calendula versus actual marigold. Now, in the garden, this plant is actually very easy to grow and loves to sprout out in full sun and be mixed around with other plants. You can see I have it here ringing the tomatoes. And one of the reasons I have it sitting here ringing around the tomatoes is because calendula and tomatoes actually do a great job of attracting beneficial and complementary insects to each other to help support their growth and well-being. And so I have an actually pretty healthy, well-going plot of tomatoes here, and part of that is because a lot of the pests and other things that would be otherwise attacking the tomatoes are taken care of by other insects brought to the area by the calendula. Now let's talk about this stuff as medicine. First off, let's talk about when to harvest this. Now, calendula, you want to make sure you're getting blooms a lot like this. And when you are harvesting, you want to make sure that you're taking not just the petals, but also the lower half and a bit of the stem of the bloom itself. Calendula is a plant that will continue to bloom regularly throughout the entire year, but you want to make sure that you're also deadheading the plant to make sure that it will continue to bloom. Because once it seeds out, and you can see right here, this is about what a bloom will look like when it's time to deadhead. And by the time it gets to this point here, seeding out, it's going to stop producing new blooms. So you want to get it at this particular point here. I'll put that one in my bag there. You can see I'm letting some seed out all the way because, well, I want to have more next year and I don't want to have to worry about getting seeds. I let it seed out, let them go down, they'll come back the next year round. In order to get the harvest, you can just go ahead and pinch, you can use clippers or whatever else, and as you're pulling the flowers off, what you're going to find is your hands will start to feel a little bit sticky. There's an actual bit of a resin on the stem that will rub off on your hands. Not a big deal, you're doing all right. So I'm pulling these, and I'm gonna go ahead and get this crop going. Now let's talk about the science of this. Calendula is kind of an ages-old folklore medicine. But one of the beautiful things about calendula, similar to echinacea, is that it has an actual bounty. Well, not a full bounty, but a substantial scientific background behind it. In a number of studies performed on mice and rats, they have found that calendula actually suppresses the growth and reproduction of a variety of bacteria and viruses, and even suppresses the growth of a few kinds of tumors that you would find in rats or mice. And then there have been single-blind studies performed on actual humans in a laboratory setting to determine its effectiveness. And one of the wonderful and remarkable things, got a little stiff, I'm getting old here, is that when compared against the control in a lot of these scenarios, they have found in a particular study where they compared the healing and anti-infection properties on people that had leg ulcers, they found that versus the control and standard treatments, that there was a 40% increase in healing and reduction in pain compared to 30% with the standard treatment, and even more so, I think it was about 20 with the control. And then in another study where they performed it on skin irritation and incision sites where women were, I need to start. Now, calendula can be used as medicine, either topically through an ointment or a salve, or taken internally through a tincture or an infusion like a tea. And these particular forms of consumption or use of it have actually been tested in laboratory settings with mice, rats, and humans in a medical setting. Now, with the mice and rats, one of the things that they have found and determined is that it had an increase in healing time on particular lesions or cuts that they received, an increase in longevity in the face of tumors and cancers that were stimulated, and those particular studies suggest that it slightly inhibited the reproduction of the cancerous cells, though that causation has not been connected, it's merely correlational. And it has also been shown to affect the growth and reproduction of a variety of bacteria, fungi, and viruses, including things like E. coli as well as Staphylococcus, one of the strains of Staphylococcus, which is a pretty powerful tool, especially if we're going to think about the way I usually use it as a topical ointment for cuts, scrapes, and bruises. In the single-blind studies on humans, one of the trials where they applied a topical ointment of calendula with women that had received surgery for breast cancer and were continuing to receive radiation treatment. The ointment was applied around the incision site, and versus the control, there was an increased rate of healing and a decreased level of pain and infection around the incision sites. And due to the dermatitis over the breast where the radiation was sent through, they applied the ointment multiple times a day compared to the control, and there was an increased ability to go through with the radiation treatment, a decreased amount of pain, discomfort, and duration of the dermatitis as a result of the radiation treatment. And in another trial where they used a saline control versus an ointment on patients that had leg ulcers, they found that there was a 40% increase in healing compared to a 30% increase in healing on the control, where there was also an increase in patient well-being, decrease in pain, discomfort, and a higher rate of complete healing versus the control, leaving fewer scars and fewer adverse results post-treatment. Now, one of the things with the science regarding these plants, and I talk about it a lot, and I think it's important to understand, none of these studies are highlighting a causational relationship between any of the plant's constituents and the effects they have on the body. And there's a number of reasons why it's very difficult to establish causational relationships with plant medicine. One being, there's so many factors and variables that contribute to a plant's constituents and power. The time of year harvested, the part of the plant harvested, the growing conditions around heat, water, time of year. There's so many variables plus so many chemicals within a plant that in order to, through the scientific method, establish absolute certainty of causation is extraordinarily difficult. But when you're able to find a number of studies that show a positive correlation, it becomes easier and easier over time through these studies to become certain of the effectiveness of the plant as medicine. Which is why I feel comfortable saying calendula is legitimate medicine. I personally try to take as few internal consumptions of the plant medicine as I can, depending on what it is, which is why a lot of the medicine I make out of plants is typically topical or ointment related. Now that we have a harvest here, let's go in and talk about exactly how to prepare the plants to get ready for an infusion into an olive oil, and then let them sit to prepare for a salve. All right, got myself a little cookie sheet here, got my harvest in my bag. I'm gonna dump it out here. I did not get as many of the flowers as I had hoped originally because I waited quite a while to harvest and I didn't deadhead properly, so I don't have as much as I would like. But if I deadheaded correctly and I still have more blooms, I may be able to kind of increase the volume of the oil infusion that I make. Now this is actually part of the preparation. I have them on the grate here to allow airflow around them. I'm going to sit them in the sun and I want them to dry out a bit. Now you heard me say in the echinacea video that if possible I like to use the fresh, wet ingredients. However, when we're dealing with olive oil, because typically if you're making a natural salve, you'd like to use organic extra virgin olive oil. That's going to give you kind of the highest quality of oil to infuse in. But the olive oil can be volatile at times. Like if you let your olive oil sit out in the sun, the UV light will cause the olive oil to oxidize and go rancid. And another way you can end up causing your olive oil to go rancid is if you have too high of a moisture content within the plants or whatever you're using that you're infusing the oil with. That's part of why you see like sun-dried tomatoes infused in olive oil. It's one of those ways. I mean, of course, you have different flavor profiles in that instance and everything else, but one of the benefits of that is it prevents the olive oil from going rancid. So I'll set these out in the sun for a little while, and you'll want to let them dry out for 12 to 24 hours, depending on the conditions that you're drying them out in. And when I go to check on them, what I'm looking for is I'll want to see crackly, crinkly, dried up leaves. And then at the base of the flower here, when I go to kind of ply it and palpate it, what I'll notice is that it's a little squishy, as though there's still something on the inside and it's kind of dry and crackly on the outside. And that's how I'll know I've gotten it enough. You can dry it out completely all the way, leave it up for a day or two. It's up to you and how comfortable you feel with your infusion, but that's typically how I will approach this, and it's what I'm going to do. So I'll go set these out in the sun, and I'll see you in a few hours. All right, we're back, but it's far more than a few hours later. I actually am a few weeks later, and it happened because I was noticing that as I was pulling the heads off, my calendula was actually continuing to sprout new blooms. So I spent the next couple of weeks pinching off blooms, letting them dry, and letting the calendula continue to make new blooms, so that way I could have more in here. And so you'll see more sitting on this than when we last checked in. And now I'm going to show you just what I do to put the calendula and get it ready for an oil. Now, the oil, the reason I use an oil is for a couple of reasons. Calendula can be taken internally to help support the immune system on a broader level, though that's not how I use it, because I'm a little bit wary of just consuming plants all the time. Not necessarily for totally good reasons, it's kind of my own personal bias, but you can use calendula oil, take it internally to help support immune functions that way. I intend to make this oil and use a topical salve to be able to put on skin around wounds or cuts or scrapes, and I'll probably actually mix that calendula oil with cottonwood bud oil in order to make kind of a particularly potent topical salve. So when I come down in here, I've got all my calendula ready to go right here. I'm just dropping it into my jar. This is actually probably going to end up being a little potent, and maybe a little more. That's actually probably about as much as I want it to be. When you have dried material, you would ideally have it up to about 2/3 of the way full of that dried material. You don't want to pack it in too much. Maybe I'll get it in there. I'll get it in there. I'll just put it all in there. We'll see what happens. Experimentation. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, so there we go. Probably about 3/4 of the way full. There we go. And then I'm going to fill it up with oil all the way to the top. I'm using olive oil. The olive oil I use, I definitely get in that bulk scenario. It's not the fully organic cold-pressed olive oil that so many others recommend. And I would recommend that if you want your highest quality possible oil. But the reason I do this is when you're making on quantity, you buy in quantity, and in order to save money, this is how I do it. Then I cap it, and I'll put it away for about 6 weeks to a few months, extra couple of months, and I will have a ready-to-go calendula oil to make a salve or use internally. Just a kind of reminder, you want it to be dry. The reason you want it to be dry is to ensure that the moisture inside does not lead to further oxidation or causing it to go rancid. So if you have too much moisture inside, it can go rancid. So having dried calendula or dried materials goes a long way here, whereas with, say, a tincture, having fresh materials is more acceptable because that alcohol prevents it from going rancid like it can with olive oil. So I'll put it in a cool, dry, dark place for 6 weeks or so, and then I'll be ready to use it for a salve. Thanks for checking in. Remember to like, subscribe, share, check out the Patreon and all that jazz. And remember, whatever you do for this land, you do for everybody.